I have a certain déjà vu here, as this is exactly the reaction my father had to my sister and her husband deciding, actually before they were married, that they didn't want children. From my point of view as little brother, I was not overly concerned, even if it would have made me an uncle. My sister was a teacher for 11 to 18-year-olds and was a year had a hell of a responsibility. Particularly when you are in a mixed-sex school of hormonal adolescents whizzing around. Although she had never said anything to me, none of my business in any case, about wanting children, it was clear 5 years into the marriage there was a mutual agreement. Now we turn to my father, and he asked me a near identical question, but in the form of, "Your sister has been married for 5 years now, and there's no sign of children. Is there anything wrong with the marriage? I thought that is what they got married for." Although I didn't say it, but my reaction was, they are an identity now and really it is none of your business. However, my verbal response was, "Well, if you think about it, Dad, she has over 600 children of her own." My father looked at me as though I hadn't listened to the question. But I explained that the point I was making, that if she has over 600 whizzing around her, she has direct control over 30 of them as a form teacher, then later 120 as year head. It may not have crossed his mind that the last thing she wanted to come home to possibly her own 2 children, no break at all. Actually, if the truth be known, and the same applies to me. Although I have never been married for other reasons, I never met Miss Wright. It was because of the way that my sister and I were treated by father emotionally. We didn't like the idea of our children anywhere near him. Mother, we would have no issues as she was great with children, and so if anything I was disappointed for her. My sister had a rather odd childhood, as for a lot of the time our father was away at sea managing cargo vessels as a merchant officer, later to be master. So he was away for 3 months at a time. And then he would come back on leave for 2 to 3 weeks, then go away again for another 3 months. This, however, had a side effect on his relationship with children, and particularly my sister and I. In short, he didn't grasp the difference between dealing with children and that we didn't stand to attention when he spoke to us, although there were times we had no option. So our relationships with our father were both very much adult-adult, not parent-child. Thankfully, it was our mother who really brought us up single-handed in hindsight. Although Dad was the sole income earner, it was Mum who ran the household for 75% of the year. Something my father never really grasped. At one end of the scale he tried to be everyone, Dad and we could play. But the next day his temper could swing and forget that we were children. In bother our cases that had a very severe effect. I was not a well child, and indeed some of the issues have rolled on into adult life. In particular, I developed epilepsy when I was 4.5. And although not frequent seizures, maybe on every few months, and perhaps some not recognized, as I had absences too, which are not always easy to detect unless you know the child well. Although my mother knew when I was taking an absence, father couldn't, and though I was ignoring him, it was mother who had to remind him. I did have some very big seizures, and one minuet I recall being in the house, only to find myself on a children's ward and no recollection how I got there. Actually very scary for a 4-year-old. Particularly when parents were not allowed to stay with their children, only at visiting times, which of course would never happen today. And we are talking about the late 1960s through to 70s when I had my problems. What my father never grasped. And indeed I didn't fully understand until I redeveloped the condition and started to research it, that actually those seizures between the ages of 4.5 and 8 years old were a dangerous time in mental development. Particularly in my case, the place in the brain where my seizure took place, both convulsive and absence, were in and around the area of short-term memory and coordination. The very large seizure I took when I was 7 years old, and had gone into delayed shock, having, unknowingly, broken my knee. something that my father had not realized either and made me walk on it. Pain incredible and passed out. Only find myself on an isolation ward, again, this time my leg in a full plaster. Actually I had not only broken my leg, but as a result of the delayed shock, in my sleep had taken a massive epileptic fit. These seizures actually damaged my short-term memory to the point where I could get lost easily, literally forgetting where I had directions back. And satellite navigation is the best thing that has ever happened for me, smiley face. The problem with short-term memory failure is that learning new skills and particularly computing suites is a real challenge. And regrettably there is an assumption that if you can't absorb a procedure first time being shown, then you must be incompetent. That has resulted in me never having had a very stable career and by default income. Also my relationships with girls, particularly in the 15 to 25 age group, has always been difficult as I came over as odd, because of these memory failures. On top of that, and actually the real killer, was that I let my job take over my life. From the time I had my very first job at 16, I was very fond of a girl I worked with. But to be professional, I never actually asked her out, etc. Mainly on the basis of, don't mix work with pleasure. In fact, I did move on and we didn't meet for about 3 years. Then I started living on my own and remembered her. Actually she had never left my mind, but had never got around to inviting her over due to the fact I had buried my head in my work. We wrote to each other, even if she was only 20 miles away, but it was always the case that one or other of us were doing something the day we planned. We did have some days out and dinners together, and I did try to express my feelings for her in other ways, but not wanting to frighten her off. Actually, in hindsight, a daft thing to do. But hindsight is a wonderful thing. I did try to show my feeling for her in the way I wrote, and always gave her a hug and kiss where we met and departed. And on some of these days out we would walk around the showground hand in hand. Rather stupidly I never said outright to her, "I love you very much." Regrettably a series of events occurred, we partially lost contact. Again my head in my work. And Big Bank came when she wrote me a letter saying that she had been seeing a man and he had proposed to her. This blew my mind, but we were too far down the line for me to recover the situation. It often crossed my mind whether she had the relationship and marriage lasted, and indeed whether these wanted and indeed did have children. Which brings us back the issue about children. I had never asked her how she felt about children or whether she had wanted to be a mother. Again, it makes me wonder whether she did indeed have children. However, there was another issue in the back of my mind, and this comes back to my father. Even if I had gone on to be married, even if it hadn't been P but another girl, if we had decided to have children, I was not confident about the way my father would be with our children given the way he treated my sister and I had had children. In my mind I don't think I would have allowed them to with him without either my would-be wife or I there. I had no issues with my mother as she was great with children, but my biggest fear was my father and he being babysitter. I am not sure if I could trust him, particularly when you have small children going the terrible 2s and 3s, not to mention when they were older at the age of 7. When his expectations would be higher, and like my sister and I not realize we were children, and therefore the same with mine. He later asked me why I had never had children nor got married. By this time I would have been in my late 30s, and my answer was twofold. I would only ever got married for love, and that love was returned. If I had children, whether I could trust them in his custody. My mother was very shocked, and even my father took a few steps back at my openness, but it was he who wanted the honest answer. So he was disappointed that neither my sister had children, in my case even by adoption, but now he had the full-on answer about the way he treated my sister and I as both teenagers and young adults. And the fact that actually his actions some 30 years prior had actually deprived both my mother and he of grandchildren. I write this out in full, and even if it is a marathon to have got through, in part to warn those spankers out there that the way you treat your children when they are very young and in their tweenage years can backfire seriously when they are older and you find yourself in a situation that you only now realize that you created. So whilst I am not suggesting that you mistreated your daughter, but if she has had indirect experience of either child abuse or unstable relationships between parent and child through school and even at college, that may give an inkling, through the experiences of my sister and I, and the long-term effect it can have. Disappointed you may be. But in the same way as you chose as husband and wife to have children, the same applies, to your daughter when she met her husband, boyfriend. They, like my sister and brother-in-law, decided not to. You can't force them to have sex and create a family so you can be mom all over again. Rather like my situation with P, I am disappointed. That she never loved me enough, nor did I tell her that I loved her very much and would have wanted to have taken things further. Equally in the back of my mind was my father. And the only way around him would have to have been to take out a court order. Short of taking a gun and threaten to kill them if they don't produce a child, then you are not going to change things now.